No animal could ever be so cruel as man. So artfully, so artistically cruel. If you had to commit a total atrocity in full assurance that it was for the greater good, do you think you could do it? And if so, could you live with yourself afterwards? One of the most captivating philosophical concepts is the moral dilemma. We are presented with two options, neither of which is particularly enticing, and asked to pick the lesser of two evils. And perhaps the most disturbing ethical choice of all time comes from Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. The situation is simple. There is a total utopia, a place where everyone is happy. The author says that the city of Omelas is perfect in almost every way, to the point of being basically unbelievable. However, it also has a dark secret. The success and prosperity of the settlement is entirely dependent on the suffering of a single child, who is locked in a basement and deprived of love, care, or joy for their entire existence. Le Guin's tale explores the consequences of this arrangement, as well as asking the key question: what is the right thing to do here? Get ready to learn the issues with utopian visions, who should legislate human values, and how we make others the scapegoats for our own sins. Now, quite unlike a lot of the other works I cover on this channel, there is, rather wonderfully, already a lot of discourse and analysis of this story online. So I'm purposefully going to go out of my way to look at it from some unfamiliar perspectives. This means I probably won't visit some of the main talking points around this story, so if you think that I've missed a very obvious theme, you're probably absolutely right. But first, let's stop and analyse the concept of utopia, and how it links with a whole series of deep human needs and human anxieties. 1. The ones who yearn for utopia. All through the 19th and 20th centuries, it became increasingly common to proclaim that history has either ended or will end rather soon. This theme arguably began in its modern form when Hegel toyed with the idea that history had ended with Napoleon, though I'm not sure how committed he was to that particular thesis. However, this too is arguably a development of the earlier Christian idea that the world will one day come to a close and the sun will judge the quick and the dead. In fact, a lot of religions touch upon this idea of a final state that we will all end up in and then remain in. Even in reincarnation-based faiths like Buddhism, there is the concept that we can one day reach nirvana and so be freed from the endless cycle of life, death, and unsatisfactoriness. And in the Abrahamic religions, the idea of heaven, or even just the earlier concept of an eternal sleep, forms a spiritual idea of utopia. But why are we so attracted to this concept? Well, if you believe some of the existential philosophers of the late 19th and 20th centuries, the concept of utopia ties in with a fundamental human yearning, the desire for stasis. In Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, he examines the human want to become a thing in itself. Sartre's philosophy is pretty complex and a little bit esoteric, so I'm going to simplify parts of it here, but I'll probably make a full video on it at some point. But, essentially, Sartre thinks that part of what makes being a human so stressful is that we are condemned to be free. That is, at any given moment we are having to make decisions and then bear and be responsible for the consequences of those decisions. We are constantly being presented with a whole swathe of different options for our actions, and then are forced to be the causal agent of our own destiny, or at the very least, our own behaviour. But for Sartre, this means we can never have the peace of just being in the same way that one might in heaven or once they'd attain nirvana. Instead, we are forced to forever be becoming. That is, shifting and changing and having to decide who we are, make commitments about who we will be. Sartre seems to think that this is a pretty universal human difficulty. We want to become in some way static or fixed, while at the same time preserving our agency as individuals. But these are necessarily in tension. The former is the comfort of actuality, but the latter is the thrill and opportunity of possibility. Friedrich Nietzsche touches upon a very similar theme when he talks about how many people want to avoid change and cling to views of the world that promise stability. Part of his analysis of why Christianity is so attractive is that God promises an afterlife that is without change and without struggle. But the first of these is just as important as the second. Heaven is not just a pleasant place, it alleviates the pressure that Sartre talked about regarding making decisions and taking responsibility. The primary difference is that Nietzsche thinks we can eventually become strong enough and have organised enough wills to embrace this change. This is one reason he admires Heraclitus most of all out of the ancient Greek philosophers. Heraclitus saw the entire world as one chaotic ball of continual change, without rest or stasis in sight. But this analysis also helps explain the appeal of Utopia. Le Guin's story is often described as a sort of dramatized trolley problem, but I think that somewhat simplifies the true extent of the dilemma. The state Le Guin talks about is not just really good, it is the promised end of history, found in everything from the Bible to Hegel to Marx to Fukuyama. It is the fulfillment of our deep desire to exist in a stable and unchanging situation. When Le Guin tells us that the society would cease to be a utopia if the child were freed or even shown some love, she is threatening to plunge Omelas back into the dialectical conflicts of history and ethics. It is not just that their lives will no longer be perfect, it is that they will have war, struggle, transformation, and responsibility. The issue is not just ethical, it is existential. It is asking us what we would be willing to do to secure freedom from all of the pressures that someone like Sartre talks about. Living in a utopia which rests on a single known variable essentially means being liberated from ethical decisions almost entirely. When we make decisions in the world, they tend to be complicated. We do not know the consequences of our choices in the long term, and the agony of important moral quandaries are an inescapable part of living, as we shall see later. But in a utopia like Omelas, this problem does not really exist. If the utopia is maintained by the suffering of this single child, then the inhabitants of Omelas can act, safe in the knowledge that their decisions will not threaten the gilded state of their world. In Le Guin's city, all of this complexity is boiled down into a single choice: whether or not that child remains in that room. It is not just an ethical decision, it is the ethical decision. It is the decision of whether or not to let ethics back into utopia and sacrifice the comforting stability of stasis for the chaos of change and decision-making. In many ways, the inhabitants of Omelas are running away from the pressures of a fully rounded, agential life. Sartre himself would probably accuse them of acting in bad faith. That is, denying their own freedom to alleviate the crushing pressure of being human. And interestingly enough, this links with the kind of worries Fyodor Dostoevsky had with the pursuit of utopia. In his view, working to bring about a materialist utopia on Earth without the aid of some divine framework is a very risky business. Because, given that utopia is the end of all further significant ethical decisions, since now things would be, intuitively, as good as they can get, the promise of utopia threatens to become a sort of moral get-out-of-jail-free card. Imagine that I truly believed my actions would culminate in the best possible society, one where no further development would be needed, and evil at the societal level would simply no longer make sense. Well, then surely I would be justified in doing anything. Perhaps even torturing an innocent child as a living sacrifice to my ultimate end. And luckily, the questions do not stop there, because Le Guin's short story is fantastic for illustrating one of my favourite developments in 20th century ethics. The idea that many moral decisions are genuinely intractable. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon for exclusive content. The link is in the description. 2. The ones who make moral choices. An underlying assumption in a great many of the discussions around ethical dilemmas is that there is, at least in theory, a right answer and a wrong answer. There is a best way to do things, and if we just talk about it long enough, we will come to the most sensible conclusion on the issue. This is often the case with conversations about the ones who walk away from Omelas as well. The question of whether or not the suffering child is a necessary evil gets batted back and forth, with ardent arguers lining up on either side. However, many philosophers have criticized this approach to moral arbitration, and some have even gone so far as to say many ethical decisions are agonizingly unanswerable. To revisit Sartre, probably the most famous example of this is found in his work Existentialism and Humanism. There, he relates a discussion he had with a student who was torn between joining the French resistance during the German occupation or staying behind to look after his suffering mother, as he was essentially the only source of joy in her life. There are many arguments he could give for and against either choice. On the one hand, if he joined the French resistance, he would be contributing to the liberation of his people, surely a noble goal. But at the same time, does he not have a duty to his family and to the mother who raised him? Moreover, as a resistance fighter, he may do very little marginal good. He does not even know if they will win, whereas he does know that he will definitely do good back home, though perhaps on a much smaller scale. On the other hand, can he live with himself knowing that he stood by while his country was overrun? What about his duties there? According to Sartre, it would be pretty arrogant to assert that there is a determinate answer here. The genuine ethical dilemmas of our lives do not appear as thought experiments, but instead as decisions forced upon us by circumstances and the passage of time. His student does not have the option not to choose. He will either join the French resistance or not, and either way, he will have to live with that decision. According to Sartre, it is by making these choices that we are crafting our own values in real time. Whether the student chooses to stay or leave, he will have decided whether family matters more to him than his country, whether he holds a certain small good over an indefinite great one. And his guilt, or lack thereof, will tell him to what extent this was the right choice, to what extent it correlated with his values. Le Guin's short story is very similar to a proposal made by Ivan to Alyosha in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. There we are asked that if a civilization thrives, but only because of the torturous death of an innocent, then is that worth it? Would the spiritual Christian Alyosha consent to craft a society that is perfectly happy if it were founded on this original act of injustice? There, Alyosha says that he would not, with the implicit question being, why would God then allow for a world with so much suffering in it in order to achieve his design of heaven? And why would it require the death of Jesus Christ, an innocent man without sin? Here, Alyosha is implicitly, ever so slightly, rebelling against God in his answer. Again, we see a sort of indeterminacy of ethics. Alyosha believes in God. He holds him to be the creator of the world, the lord of all that exists, and the crafter of right and wrong. Yet he still doubts whether what God has done is good. He brushes up against Ivan's idea that if there is a God, it may be one worth rebelling against. The Brothers Karamazov is just so good. I promise I am working on a video on it. I've kind of got the draft of a plan of something, but I think it's going to end up being like 3 hours long. And I don't think it'll be out for probably months. And to go from these more existential concerns over to the world of analytic philosophy, this indeterminacy of moral choices at the individual level was mirrored by increasing skepticism of determinate ethical answers in the abstract. Famously, A.J. Ayer and others like him argued that ethical statements were akin to outbursts of emotion rather than propositions about reality. He thought that when we deemed something was wrong, all we were really doing was expressing our emotional distaste for that bit of behavior. We were going boo at it in order to encourage others not to engage in it. Here, the question of whether or not the child's imprisonment is just cannot be settled by debate. It is, at its heart, a question of instinct and emotion. It is not what we can reason about, it is what we can emotionally tolerate. In other words, what we can square with our conscience. Le Guin's story ends by discussing those who walk away from the city. These are the people who have decided that they cannot benefit from the child's suffering. They cannot square it with their conscience that Omelas thrives on this act of cruelty, and so they leave. But, interestingly, the moral dilemma in the story is framed as the decision to stay or to abandon Omelas. The question of freeing the child is not really highlighted. It is the ones who walk away from Omelas, not the ones who rebel against it. I am not the first to point out that both Le Guin's narrative and Dostoevsky's bear significant resemblance to the Christian account of Christ's death. There is the innocent party, Jesus himself, tortured to death in order to redeem our sins and secure paradise for the rest of us. Our redemption is bought at the cost of sinless suffering. But I love Le Guin's choice that even the ones who walk away are not playing the part of some great hero rescuing Jesus from the cross, but rather Pontius Pilate, washing his hands of evil and retreating back into his villa. Even those who object are embodying the agony of ethical indeterminism. The choice of whether to stay or to go is forced upon them every single day they make the conscious choice to reside in the city, and so they are compelled to make a commitment either way, eventually absenting themselves from the injustice. But they are not forced to make a decision about freeing the child. They can safely push that further dilemma to the back of their minds. From one perspective, the ones who walk away are the closest we will get to the paragons of the tale, the people who will not let the cruelty hurled at the child pass unnoticed. But from a different perspective, they are running from the much more significant choice. And, in their shoes, would we really do any different? Many of us also do not seek out ethical decisions, but rather only engage with them when they are forced upon us. We often do not ask, what is the best thing to do full stop, but rather, what is the best choice to make when I am compelled to choose? And if you believe the claims of some philosophers like Peter Singer, we may be blinding ourselves to just how much harm we are letting happen. Condemned to be free indeed, but not condemned to notice the extent of the freedom. But all of this is arguably dancing around a much bigger point, which is the justification given for the child's torment. And here, I don't mean the utilitarian line about it being for the greater good, as interesting as that is, but rather the fact that it is sanctioned by almost all the inhabitants of Omelas. So, let's take a stroll through the history of values to see who has inherited the moral power of God himself. 3. The ones who legislate values. At the end of the 18th century, one question dominated the hearts and minds of Europe. How are we to legitimize political authority and, by extension, public morality? For the previous 7 centuries, the majority of Europe had been ruled by monarchies, and the philosophy which supported these monarchies was the divine right of kings. The king or queen held that they were appointed by God to rule over their domain. Thus, Charles I believed that the English Civil War was inherently illegitimate because it was not just a rebellion against him and his fellow aristocrats, but a direct challenge to the authority of God himself. But the American and French revolutions severely challenged this paradigm. The nobility were not only being usurped as the centres of political power, but also as the legislators of values. This went doubly so for the explicitly anti-religious French revolutionaries, who rejected the legitimacy of church authority pretty much entirely. So, the question then arose. What justified the moral authority of these new republics? What made their rule moral? From the perspective of a governor or a ruler, or someone being governed or ruled, we normally don't want power to simply be a brute fact. We would like a philosophy to justify it. Enter Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, to skim over a lot of details, held that societies could only be justified by the collective consent of the people. He famously said that it was not a king or a nobility, but a social contract which differed a legitimate government from an illegitimate one. When Albert Camus is recapping some of this history in The Rebel, he points out this is a real change in where moral authority is seen to originate from. God has been usurped, and he has been replaced by a general idea of what the people want. For Camus, this naturally followed from the challenge to God as the author of moral values. We have to replace him with some sort of judge, and if we're going to also replace monarchies and aristocracies with democracies and republics, then the people are a pretty natural follow-through. But Camus also points out some consequences of this idea. If we make the people the ultimate arbiter of what is right, then we somewhat lose the ability to condemn what democracies or republics may do to their own people. In other words, under this framework, if almost everyone agrees to something, then it becomes a legitimate exercise of power. Personally, I think Rousseau could probably get around this, but Camus points out that this philosophy is ripe for abuse. He paints this as partly behind the excesses of Robespierre's reign of terror. Since he was wielding the will of the people, it just could not be in question whether executing so many people was doing the right thing. It was the post-revolutionary version of having been sent on a holy crusade by God. And so, temporarily, it placed the Committee for Public Safety as beyond reproach. Right, a fun, if simplified, history lesson. But this philosophy adds another layer of complexity to the conundrum of the people of Omelas. Because it is not just that the child is suffering for the benefit of all others, but with the explicit consent and approval of the rest of the city. By the logic of this post-Enlightenment view, this is a perfectly legitimate exercise of power. It is the people acting in their own best interests and using their sovereignty to enact a choice. The extra tension then comes from the additional connotations of freeing the child. It is no longer just correcting a cruelty, it is also undermining the sovereign will of the people of a nation to govern their own citizens. It's not simply a trade-off of interests, it raises the very question of whether there is a higher moral authority than a democratic populace, and if so, how is that established? Once again, we find this worry prefigured in Dostoevsky. His concern with humanism and materialism more generally was that without the recognition of some higher power than any one person or collection of people, he thought we would inevitably learn to justify atrocities. This was one reason he became so opposed to materialist revolutionary organizations later in his life. He saw their logic as opening the door to all manner of horrors, and predicted that if we became too in the habit of letting ourselves or governments become moral legislators, then we would free our consciences to kill, maim, and plunder, and still somehow find it within ourselves to call it good. This is why he would see all of the terrors of the 20th century as totally unsurprising. We obviously don't have to agree with the particulars of Dostoevsky's viewpoint here, but we do have to confront the very same question. In a world without a universal moral legislator, i.e. God, by what standard do we tell others when they are doing something wrong? Anyone who wants to free the imprisoned child in Omelas essentially is saying, it does not matter how many people you get to agree to this, or what sovereign authority you appeal to. This situation is morally wrong. Le Guin and Dostoevsky both ask us to justify this appeal to absolute spiritual legitimacy. If we decide to free the child, on what grounds are we doing so? Are we taking the Nietzschean route and aspiring to become gods ourselves as individuals? Are we using some higher principle or authority to justify our decision? And if so, where does that come from? Are we, like Sartre, simply choosing and letting this be our commitment, creating our values in the process? The reason Le Guin's thought experiment is so interesting, and strikes a little bit deeper than a more isolated one like the trolley problem, is because it touches upon all of these different threads of our ethical and meta-ethical concerns. It asks us not just what the right thing to do is, but on what basis the phrase "the right thing to do" even makes sense. Taking this into account, perhaps we can have a more charitable interpretation of the ones who walk away from Omelas. Whereas in the last section we pondered whether this was avoiding a moral decision, perhaps it is instead recognizing the limitations of their philosophy. With the action done by almost total assent, would it not be incredibly epistemically arrogant to free the child? It would be saying, I know more than everyone else in this city about what is right and what is wrong. And perhaps they would be correct in that assessment. But it's a hell of a gamble to make. But lastly, I want to take a closer look at something that we have touched upon earlier in the video, and arguably the most interesting underlying theme in Le Guin's story, the enigmatic figure of the scapegoat. 4. The ones who carry our sins. On a first reading, one of the things that surprised me most about Le Guin's portrayal of Omelas is that the citizens of the city actually recognize the child they are tormenting as innocent. When they go to see the child, they are shocked and horrified. Many of them have a moral crisis. But, on the face of it, this is rather strange. Most of the time when we feel we have to enact some cruelty, we use some form of reasoning to ensure the recipient of our brutality deserves it. For instance, in the witch trials of Europe, people would often accuse others of witchcraft if they had some land dispute with them, or otherwise stood to benefit from their removal. However, this may not have been some purely calculated Machiavellian move on their part. It may have been that they became more predisposed to truly believe that their neighbour was a witch because of the bad will developed from the dispute. And this had the bonus effect of explaining the general misfortunes befalling their town or village. What was a widespread tension or malcontentment was displaced onto an individual or set of individuals who then took the hit for everyone else's unhappiness or competition. In other words, there was a scapegoat. Perhaps the most famous theories about scapegoats come from the French philosopher René Girard. He posited that societies inevitably involve conflict and internal strife and tension. This leads to a build-up of anger and frustration amongst the populace. Girard claims this could lead to the collapse of the civilization in question if all that energy were not dispensed with somewhere. So, an individual or a small group of individuals are singled out as uniquely awful, the cause of all of this misery and the bearers of the responsibility for it. Thus, they must be dealt with, either by exile or by death. Bear in mind, I'm obviously simplifying Girard's overall point. He has an entire book on this. It bears a passing resemblance to the Nietzschean idea that we have a deep-seated will to cruelty that must be released somehow, and is often done so with the accompanying proposition, which for Nietzsche is delusory, that our cruelty is also somehow right. In both cases, the moral judgment is not the straightforward motivation for the brutality, but rather the post hoc or per hoc rationalization of the decision to be cruel. Broadly speaking, Girard outlines a two-step process to the sacrifice of the scapegoat. At first, the scapegoat is demonized as evil, the origin of all of the problems in that society. But, crucially, this is only prior to the sacrifice. Afterwards, the scapegoat sometimes takes on a bizarre sort of veneration. They might be heralded as victims, or sanctified as part of a ritual. Again, to draw from the witch trials, the people executed now stand as a testament to human injustice, even more so than, say, a murder victim. The same goes for many of those who died during Robespierre's reign of terror. On the face of it, the child in Le Guin's tale bears a pretty strong resemblance to Girard's scapegoat. Their suffering is supposed to keep peace and prosperity, and their joy is the herald of destruction. They are victimized because it is believed, rightly or wrongly, that doing so will maintain the public good. However, the thing that separates Le Guin's child from the standard scapegoat is that the sacrifice is never completed. The child's suffering is made sacred in a sense, since everyone seems to view them as a total innocent, a crying lamb brought to the slaughter. But, whereas most scapegoats will shuffle off into non-existence, the child instead remains alive, suffering, but alive. The citizens of Omelas are not allowed to forget what they have done, because they are, at every moment, renewing the sacrifice. Again, this adds another layer of complexity to the ethical situation, this time along the lines of our own guilt. If Gerard is to be believed, the scapegoat maneuver is not uncommon. We may not execute people for it anymore, at least in the UK. But, if he is right, we will often heap our own sins onto someone else and then ostracize them or punish them in order to alleviate our own inner guilt and shame. To again draw from Camus, this time in The Fall, we spit in someone else's eye so that ours will not be spat in first. But Le Guin's tale reminds us that when we move on from these actions, forgetting what we have done and forgiving ourselves for them, we are sort of playing a trick. While the consequences of a decision like this may fall into the past and so be out of our immediate sight, it is still real as the child in Omelas. All the repentance in the world will not undo the suffering we have caused, and the best we can hope for is either to try to ignore the pain we have enacted, or to walk away, praying that distance will assuage our guilty conscience. To tie this back to the question about moral legislation earlier, another job that God can do is wipe our slates clean, forgive us our trespasses. But who can do that for us now? When do we decide that someone has gained moral absolution and can move on with a refreshed soul? Or is such an extreme form of forgiveness simply an outdated concept? Should we learn to live with our own perpetual guilt? I do not have the answers to these questions, but I do think they are genuinely important. Forgiveness is part of how we maintain peace and resolve conflicts in our communities, since none of us are perfect. And so having a worked-out philosophy of forgiveness strikes me as a fantastic task for the secular age. And it's yet another issue that Le Guin's tale brings to the forefront of our minds. However, I also want to draw attention to another aspect of Le Guin's story, namely what she does not say. We are reassured throughout the tale that the child's suffering is, in some sense, necessary for the continued thriving of Omelas. But Le Guin decides not to explain this relationship further. It could be that the town has made a deal with a cruel god, or that these are the metaphysical principles of the universe they inhabit. But no such definite system is granted to us, at least not in the text. Instead, we have to take the narrator's word for it. But in this choice, Le Guin subtly touches upon the way scapegoating quite often works in our world. Of course, the scapegoat is not actually responsible for all of the ills of a community, and exiling them does not solve all of the problems. Even for Gerard, who at points suggests that scapegoating is unavoidable, still only says it will grant a temporary peace within a society that will inevitably flare up again, at which point a new scapegoat will be demanded. This is one reason Gerard thinks the actual aim of scapegoating must be suppressed when the act is occurring. If we recognised it for what it was, the unfair attribution of sins and the subsequent abuse of an ordinary person, then we would be much more hesitant about taking part in it. Le Guin's tale is fascinating because it displays a society self-consciously scapegoating someone, making them suffer while at the same time recognising their innocence. But the inevitable question hangs in the air. Does the child actually need to suffer because of some law of the universe Omelas inhabits? Or is this a lie the citizens tell themselves? Is this simply a scapegoat myth that allows Omelas to be a paradise because all of its wrongs are being borne by this innocent child? The citizens of the city are unusual in recognizing that their scapegoat has done nothing wrong. But Le Guin leaves it open whether they are deceiving themselves about their scapegoat's necessity. And if they are, we are forced to ask ourselves the same question. For Gerard, scapegoats are considered a sort of necessary evil, but Le Guin's story implicitly questions this assessment. Can it be that when we make a person a scapegoat, we are not just performing some sort of ugly necessity, taking on the grim responsibility of doing what must be done, a la the realist politics of Machiavelli, but rather committing an action that is not just cruel, but totally optional? As I've mentioned at multiple points in the video, Le Guin's story is often compared to Philippa Foot's famous trolley problem. The innocent child stands in for the one person tied on one set of tracks, and the people of Omelas are the 5 people tied on the other set. We are then asked whether we would divert the train to run over the child in order to save the good people of Omelas and guard their prosperity. But lurking beneath the surface is another idea. That when we are scapegoating someone, the framing of the trolley problem is just a comforting illusion in our heads. We are not sacrificing the 1 to save the 5, but rather tying someone to the tracks so we don't have to consider whether we deserve their fate. It is part of Le Guin's genius that she manages to present a thought experiment, undermine it, and psychoanalyze it all in 5 pages. And if there is one thing I would urge you to do after watching this video, it is to give it a read for yourself. I can be almost certain that you will come away from it with your moral sensibilities shaken, and perhaps even shattered. But if you want to explore some more disturbing tales with interesting philosophical themes, then click here to peer into the dark mind of Harlan Ellison and see his apocalyptic vision for the future. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.